This is the story of Walter Lichtenstein Abroad. In 1913, Walter Lichtenstein, a librarian, scholar, and book buyer in the employ of Northwestern University, set out on a grand tour of the capitals of South America. The purpose of this trip, which would take him nearly 2 years to complete, was to make contact with lucrative book traders in those countries and to acquire huge quantities of rare and valuable Latin American legal materials for the Ivy League and illustrious Eastern and Midwestern libraries in America. When he finally arrived back in the United States, Lichtenstein would bring with him a massive collection of Latin American scholarly materials, but also a storm of diplomatic controversy that would ultimately lead to his firing from Northwestern for his German sympathies during the First World War. Lichtenstein's venture was funded by a number of prestigious libraries at the time, all of whom had an interest in acquiring Latin American primary source documents and legal materials. Among these libraries were the Northwestern University Law Library, the Northwestern University Library, the John Crear Library, the American Antiquarian Society, the John Carter Brown Library, and the Harvard College Library. To get around in-country and to cross borders, he received a passport and letters of introduction, which would gain him access to the American embassies there. In the summer of 1913, Lichtenstein departed for Panama, not knowing that the length of his trip would be nearly 2 years, not one, or that he would return in infamy. Lichtenstein could hardly have arrived in South America at a more politically unstable time. Nearly half of the countries he visited were in the process of some kind of revolution, and many of Lichtenstein's accounts were marked by swashbuckling adventures of ducking bullets and derailed trains, though Lichtenstein delivered these anecdotes in as dry and dismissive a manner as possible, always the unflappable, unimpressed German scholar. Despite the political instability, Lichtenstein was able to acquire thousands of primary source documents that would lay the foundation of the Latin American collections of illustrious American libraries for decades to come. Had he simply returned at this point, he would have been feted by all the old Brahmin schools for his amazing accomplishment. But then, during his last stay in Buenos Aires, the First World War began. Lichtenstein, a native German, was understandably torn in his allegiances. The United States, his adopted home, was still neutral in the conflict. Germany was not yet the enemy. Meanwhile, Germany was ramping up its war efforts, calling for young German men around the world to report for duty, and stirring up patriotic sentiments in preparation for the first major campaigns of the war. On top of his patriotic concerns, Lichtenstein was presented by a more pressing problem: how to get back to the United States at all. European navies had swarmed the Atlantic, and no South American ships would be able to sail directly to American ports for months. So, torn in his loyalties and looking for a way to get back home, Lichtenstein set sail on an ocean liner bound for neutral Italy, where he would then make his way to the United States via some other neutral European port. It was on this voyage that Lichtenstein met a young German officer carrying sensitive diplomatic cables from the German embassy in Buenos Aires to Berlin. Knowing that British and French pickets would board and search the ship, Lichtenstein agreed to take possession of the cables and hide them in his own luggage. And although the cables were never discovered, it was discovered that Lichtenstein had agreed to carry them. By the time Lichtenstein arrived in Genoa, the Americans were already waiting for him. Lichtenstein was stripped of his passport and his letters of introduction and told he would not be able to return to the United States anytime soon. Desperate now, Lichtenstein crossed over the Alps and made his way to Germany, where German diplomats reluctantly arranged safe passage for Lichtenstein back to New York by way of Rotterdam. By the time he arrived in New York at the end of 1914, several million Germans, Belgians, French, and Englishmen were already in northern France. General Ludendorff would soon destroy several Russian army groups at Tannenberg, and it was already becoming clear that World War I would not be another regional Franco-Prussian struggle, but something never before seen in its scope. Out of all of this, Lichtenstein made his way down the gangplanks in New York Harbor, expecting to be greeted as a returning hero by the libraries who had funded his expedition. He most certainly was not. His financiers at Harvard chastised him and then cut ties with him. Shortly thereafter, the rest of the libraries followed, and in the anti-German fervor that began sweeping across the United States, Northwestern fired him for his act of near treason. Yet, for all that, Lichtenstein's work was not in vain. By his efforts, he helped establish an international network of Latin American and North American booksellers, which would build the early Latin American collections of the prestigious East Coast and Midwestern libraries. After being forced out of the library profession, Lichtenstein went into the far more lucrative and probably more sensible career in banking, where he climbed to the rank of vice president and made a lot of money. In short, Lichtenstein's academic career was ruined by the whole ordeal, and his contributions to opening the South American-North American scholarly book trade of the 20th century were mostly forgotten for a time. But Lichtenstein did not, after all, suffer too much for it.